Without road signs, how would you know where to go? It wasn't always easy. It may be hard to imagine that you could get lost, but out on the open prairie, everything looked the same. Huge fields of waving grass. One pioneer wrote that everybody was so turned around that they were uncertain which was the right way to go. Sometimes you got help from trees or rocks or water holes. In places on the trail, there were big rocks with funny shapes, or water that looked and tasted unusual, or trees that were bent in strange ways. The early fur trappers and traders who had gone west had given names to many of these things. So when the pioneers traveled in their covered wagons, they looked for these landmarks. When you saw one, you knew you were going in the right direction. You also knew how far you had come. One famous landmark was called Chimney Rock. It was a tall column sitting on a bed of rock and rose about 500 feet from the ground into the air, about 40 stories high. You can probably guess why it was called that name. When you reached Chimney Rock, you had traveled some 550 miles from Independence, Missouri. Guys, you can actually look up Chimney Rock on the internet and see pictures of it. Another famous landmark was Independence Rock. Some people say that it got that name because early travelers reached it on July 4th and celebrated Independence Day there. You can also look that one up too, you guys. It was a great rock shaped like a turtle's back, and you could see it from far away. Independence Rock was a favorite place to climb. You also knew who had traveled before you because many people carved or painted their names into the rock. In one spot, a whole wagon train joined together and painted the Oregon Company, 1843, on the rock. Children loved one landmark called Soda Springs. It had bubbling water that you could drink. When you bent your head near the water, the bubbles tickled your nose. And there was a place called Steamboat Springs. Here, water came rushing up 2 to 3 feet in the air from cracks in the rock. It was blowing, splashing, and spraying, whizzing and sizzling, and making the puff-puff sound of a steamboat. There was also a very scary landmark that Jesse Applegate called Devil's Backbone. If you think about how narrow your backbone is, you will understand why this was a place you would never forget. When Jesse's wagon train reached Devil's Backbone in 1843, the trail was very narrow. On the left side, the cliff went down about 1,000 feet. On the right side, it was worse. The cliff went all the way down to the Snake River, which seemed about a mile down. A mile is 5,280 feet. Here's what it kind of looked like. At some spots on Devil's Backbone, there was room for not much more than a wagon. Then everybody got out and walked in front of and behind the wagons until the trail got wider. If you travel west today, you can see all of these places yourself. Can you guys see that? What is the Continental Divide? If you drew an imaginary line along the top of the Rocky Mountains from the north to the south, you would have drawn the Continental Divide. This is the place in the United States where the great rivers flow in different directions. On the west side, all the rivers flow toward the Pacific Ocean. And on the east side, they all flow toward the Atlantic. The wagons crossed the Continental Divide at a place called South Pass. It was an opening in the mountains that was so wide, it didn't seem as if you had crossed anything very important. Then you reached a spot called Pacific Springs. There you could watch the first waters on your trip flowing west. You knew you were at least halfway to Oregon. What special tricks of the trail did the pioneers learn? When you lived for 5 or 6 months in a covered wagon, traveling almost every day, you had to learn or invent new ways to do things. Here's a problem the pioneers had to solve. What could you do when the oxen's feet got sore? If you got tired from walking and your feet were very sore, you could climb up into the wagon and ride for a while. But what were the oxen supposed to do? The pioneers learned a trick from the Indians. First, you cut a small piece of animal skin, then you make small holes all around the edges and put a string or narrow strip of leather through the holes to make a drawstring. Then you put the side with the hair around the ox's foot and pull the string up tight and tie it like a shoelace. After 2 days of wearing these moccasins, the ox's feet would feel better. It was also very important to know how to find your way back to the wagon train if you got lost out on the prairie. The trail was usually close to the river, so you would be safe if you could find your way to the water. If you had gone out exploring on the prairie, it wasn't always easy to see the river. Although the land looked flat, the rivers usually ran in a valley. Sometimes the sides of the riverbanks were 60 feet high. The secret was to follow the buffalo tracks. The buffalo walked in single file, many rows of them, to the river to drink. They used the same paths over and over again, so their paths were sometimes 10 inches deep and a foot wide. You couldn't miss them. The pioneers also learned how to leave messages on the trail for wagons coming after them. Sometimes notes were written on the bones of cattle that had died along the way. Do you remember the other trick of the trail described in this book? How do you make butter while the wagon is moving? How do you keep eggs from breaking as you ride over bumpy trails? How do you dry meat to make it last a long time? How do you make fire without wood? How do we know what it was like to travel west in a covered wagon? We know a lot about the wagon trains from diaries that the pioneers wrote. When you kept a diary, you try to write down what happened every day. You write about what you see and think. You can write down anything that interests you, including what other people say or do. Many diaries were written by grown-ups, but sometimes children wrote them too. Helen Scott was 11 years old when she traveled west in a covered wagon, and she kept a diary. Jesse Applegate was also young when his family went to Oregon. He didn't write a diary then, but he wrote about the trip when he grew up. One thing he remembered was how big the prairie dog cities were. He said he thought some seemed as great as New York City. And Helen Carpenter was 19 years old when she went west and wrote in her diary that buffalo meat was delicious. You can learn a lot about the Oregon Trail from reading diaries because each person wrote about different things. If you were a shoemaker, you might write about how the Indians made moccasins. If you were a doctor, you might name all the plants you saw that would make good medicines. If your wagon wheel broke, you might write about how to make a new one. What do you think you would have written about? Is there anything left of the old Oregon Trail? Today, you can drive on highways over much of the old Oregon Trail. Along the way, you can see some of the places you have read about in this book. In fact, at many places on the old Oregon Trail, you can stand in the wagon ruts made by the covered wagons that went west so many years ago. There are places that you can go where you could see these still, you guys. They made such an impression into the ground that they are still there today. And that's the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something about pioneers and you're curious to learn more. Thanks for listening.